Hey everyone, Brendan Sander here. How are you? Thanks so much for joining me and welcome to Albums Turning 30, Comebacks or Catastrophes. So we're going to take a look at 5 albums that came out in 1994, 30 years ago, and discuss whether or not these albums were actually the comebacks that they should have been or whether or not they were actually just a catastrophe, whatever that might mean. But all in all, being 2024 and looking 30 years back at 1994, it was a strange time for music. Glam metal music, which had ruled the charts through the 80s, was gone. It was out. Classic 70s rock was starting to make a comeback. But the king of the airwaves, grunge, was on its way out. And really, there was nothing there to take over the mantle as grunge was falling away. So these albums come out in 1994 to really varying degrees of success because there was no real marketing strategy for any of this out there. Some of these even really running under the radar. But now, 30 years later, we're going to take a look back and determine whether or not these were comebacks or catastrophes. All right, so we're going to get into that here in just a bit. But before we start, if you're new to my channel and you haven't already hit the subscribe button, please do. Also, leave a comment, hit like. All those things help support my channel. I'd greatly appreciate it. And of course, as an added bonus, by turning on notifications, you'll stay up to date on everything going on in the world of music, just like this with albums turning 30, comebacks or catastrophes. So we're going to kick into this. We're just doing this alphabetical, so it's not a ranking or anything like that. First one up, the Black Crowes, Amorica, their third studio album, certified gold in the US, so 500 copies sold, so certainly doing all right. Ultimately, the songs on this were made up from the Toll Sessions, which was an album due to come out in 1993, but didn't see the light of day until 2006 as part of the Lost Crows package. But had this album come out in 93, I don't know that it would have made that much difference in it. The band itself was really beginning to move away from what was certainly their debut and even the follow-up album, the Southern Harmony and Musical Companion. And so this album here, the band had sort of gone off into different territories, and I wonder how much of that had to the effect of where this album would be seen when released. And ultimately itself, like I said, had it come out in 1993, it might have fared a little bit better than it coming out in 1994, which is sort of a wasteland of time. Still though, the Black Crowes and their sound at that time was much more of what was going on than, say, any of the glam metal bands trying to continue on the way, say, Motley Crue 1994, that album did, or some of the other bands of that era doing the same sort of thing. So you would think with the sound of what the Black Crowes were at that time, that they would be able to really hold on to what they had set up from the debut and the follow-up album. But it unfortunately didn't really happen, and at least for me on this particular release, there's some really big, major standout tracks. In particular, the first two, Gone and A Conspiracy, and the song A Conspiracy being the first single was a huge track off of this thing, and it really kind of exploded the same way Remedy did off of the previous album. And so they had the big hit, they just weren't able to sustain it. But they ventured into some other territory with hi-hat blues and stuff like that. But Wiser Time, a song that they released later on in the promotional cycle, sort of returned them to that. I just don't think it was enough to carry the album through on it. And there's some other great songs on here like Sunflower and stuff like that, where the album probably should be seen better today than maybe it was at the time, but it might actually be in reverse, because I know some people I've talked to who think this was a fantastic album at the time who don't see it as positively today, and vice versa. I know that I enjoyed it very much at the time, but I don't go back to this as often, as I don't think it's as solid of an effort. So I think when I look at this album, while I'm not calling it a catastrophe, I don't think it was the continuation, not really so much a comeback for them, because they were already riding high, while Southern Harmony Musical Companion was not the big seller the way that the debut was. was, and maybe they were hoping this would either continue with 2 million in sales or whether or not it was going to return them to the former glories of the debut. It didn't do either, and it only went gold, selling 500,000 copies. So at least that's where this one stands. You'll have to answer whether this album was the comeback or catastrophe, that the band was looking for. All right, moving on. Next up, we have Tom Petty, Wildflowers, his second solo album, but 12th studio album, including The Heartbreakers or his time in Traveling Wilburys. First new album from Tom in 3 years, though. And in the interim, though, he released a greatest hits to sort of sum things up. He had also signed a new record deal. So this being the first album on Warner Brothers after having spent his career on MCA Records. And he worked with a new producer here, Rick Rubin. Sort of all things that could have spelled trouble for Tom Petty, but it didn't. This album uncharacteristically became a huge success for him, selling 3 million copies and having a very unlikely hit in the song You Don't Know How It Feels. It was neither sounding like anything that was going on at the time. I do tend to think that the song, having had the line Take Another Toke in it, ended up making it edgy and people liked that. I think that brought it more notoriety than anything, but MTV played the heck out of it. Radio played the heck out of it. And it's got to be probably my least favorite song on the album, but the rest of the album as a whole is a very good album. And all in all, they in 2020 released a box set celebrating this thing and how well it had done, releasing a bonus album called All the Rest, because Wildflowers was intended to be a double album, but was pared down because the record label didn't think it would do as well. And I'm really kind of curious whether or not it would have been the comeback album for Tom Petty, because his first solo album, I think, did 5 million in sales. Then he did Into the Great Wide Open, which I think still did 2 million. So while very successful, not as successful as the solo album. So this album here was supposed to return him to those former glories, and it did sell better and critically was much better than previous Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers album, but it didn't quite live up to Full Moon Fever. Although I don't think you can certainly shake your head at all at a 3 million sales album. So had it come out as a double album, would it have done as well? Who knows? I do like the way that the cards fell, though, in the end of the day, where we got this box set later on with all this great unreleased material. Maybe had it been a double album, it would have been too much to digest. This, having had 15 tracks on it, was a bit too much in my opinion. Probably should have been 12 tracks on here, 12 tracks on a second disc, 24 total could have worked out. The box set would later have 10 tracks on it, although I hear there's a bunch more. There's about 20 tracks to have chosen from to have made up what that second disc was. But all in all, I do think that this album was the comeback that everyone was looking for. It was the huge success and the seller, and I don't think it has waned over time, and certainly, in my opinion, was no catastrophe at all. Okay, next up, the Rolling Stones' Voodoo Lounge 20th studio album. This one here was, I think an amazing feat for a band to have done 20 studio albums since their self-titled album. But, first new album from the band in 5 years. So after the big return that was 1989's Steel Wheels and the huge, stadium tour affair that was, could they maintain things on this album here? And they had also signed a new record deal in the interim. And that's something that's I noticed putting together these couple different episodes about albums turning 30s. How many of the bands had signed new record deals? And in some cases, it might have helped the band. In most cases, I think it tended to hurt the band because these labels were looking for the big out-of-the-gate sellers the way that previous albums had done. And when that didn't happen, these labels were ready to just drop these bands. And so this album here, being the first release on Virgin Records after predominantly the band being on the Columbia Records label, at least in the US. It was also the first album to be recorded after the departure of Bill Wyman, who retired from the band, having felt that 30 years was enough time in the group. And who knew, certainly not him, I think, that the band would continue on, and just recently having celebrated their 60th anniversary. So 30 years later, Bill Wyman thought 30 years was enough time in a rock band, and the band ended up doing double that time, 60. So I guess he would have been a very unhappy camper had he stuck around in there. But all in all, the album, I think, proved to be a huge success, selling 2 million copies, and probably even making the iconic band bigger than they were, because having built on the previous success of Steel Wheels and continuing to do it, certainly making a bigger, better image for the band. Curious though, over time though, I don't think this album has stood up as well as to where it was thought of at the time when they released this album. I loved the album. It was the first album that was new for the Rolling Stones with my involvement or my following of the band. I certainly remember the Steel Wheels era, but I didn't buy that album. I just knew the singles. I knew they were on the radio, who they were, that they were a big band, all that sort of stuff. But then when the hype, wheels started turning for this album, I got on board with that. I couldn't wait to explore this. It had a different sound on it because they had introduced more samples and backbeats and things like that, the drum loops and stuff. But the opening track, Love Is Strong, You Got Me Rockin', was a killer song that was on here. I love the song Sparks Will Fly. That one is just right in your face, moves all the way through. The Worst. It just keeps going. The songs that are on this one are really, really solid all the way through, in my opinion. And so I think this definitely is sort of the quote comeback or the continuation that the band, the label, were hoping for. They got out of the Rolling Stones. It certainly was not a catastrophe, although I don't know what the label might have been expecting, but I definitely think it was what everyone was looking for from the band. But I know in the other side of the coin, certainly I'm sure there's a lot of Rolling Stones fans that think the album is a catastrophe because it didn't return the band to the straight up rock sounds. It had them venturing off in a 90s alternative rock territory with those dance beats and drum loops and stuff like that as well. Even some rap thrown in on this stuff. So could be considered a catastrophe amongst some Rolling Stone fans, but all in all, I don't think that it is. All right, next up we have Yes, Talk, their 14th studio album. The band returned to the lineup that they had recorded their classic 90125 album with in 1983, so resulting in the song Owner of a Lonely Heart. I think everybody thought that that was going to, be a real big deal for this album here, certainly after the lackluster interest that was shown to Union from 1991, where the band had combined both the 70s era lineups and the 80s era lineups of the band together into a really big sort of incarnation of the band itself. But it just didn't reestablish the band as they were in 1983 with the big hit and all of that sort of stuff. So Talk would become the last album to feature guitarist Trevor Rabin, which he's the one who really had brought that new sound to the band. So returning to that lineup, having had Trevor Rabin, I think that everyone kind of thought that this album was going to be more of that. But all in all, it was actually very different than those two albums that they had recorded, 90125 in 83 and Big Generator in 87, which was even different than that in and of itself. So maybe not all that surprising that the album would be different. I mean, Yes doesn't really churn out repetitious albums. They've kind of always done their own thing, and this album would be more of that. But what was interesting is I felt that this album ended up having more of a element that would make it sound like a bridge between the 70s and 80s material than the album Union did. Union was really just two different versions of the band bringing songs together and neither side really collaborating on them. Whereas this album here took the pop sensibilities of what was that 80s sound, and of course having Trevor Rabin on it gives it that element, but they also went back to longer compositions and sounds and more of the guitar exploration, soloing, the instrumentation aspect of these songs. And so for me, this album was more of a bridge between 70s and 80s than, say, Union was. Interestingly, it was also the first album appearing on new label Victory Records after the band having spent their whole career on Atlantic. So in this particular case, I do think that it was a problem for the band. Had they had Atlantic behind them, it might have gotten pushed more. But all in all, and I think Victory might have gone out of business very soon after its release, and so there was no promotion behind it. But this was one of those things that had I not worked in a record store at the time, I probably would be unexposed to this album. But knowing that it came out and being someone who was allowed to choose what was played in the store, I played it incessantly and really fell in love with it a lot. Ultimately becoming a very big fan of Yes through this album here, more so than any of the earlier stuff, because again, this would be my first Yes album coming out, having become a fan because I grew up during the eras of the first 2 or 3 albums that I talked about, but not picking those up until later on. This album here, I think most people would talk about being a catastrophe or failure because it didn't do well. It did not return any more attention to the band. It wasn't a success overall, but I think it's a fantastic album and actually should be looked at in a lot better light 30 years on than when it was originally. And that's something else to be thought about for all of these albums. Where are they seen or viewed today versus 30 years ago when they came out? Are they seen better today than when they came out? This is an album that I think ultimately should be seen better, but probably is not, unfortunately. All right, and the last one here to talk about is Neil Young and Crazy Horse, Sleeps with Angels. This was his 8th studio album with Crazy Horse's famous backing band, but 22nd studio album overall, not counting the time that he spent in Buffalo Springfield, which was another band that Neil Young was part of. Released as the follow-up to his hugely successful Harvest Moon album from 1992, which in and of itself was a follow-up to Harvest from 1972. So certainly riding high at the time. Neil returns to his tried and true backing band, Crazy Horse. But this one here should have had him returning to a more classic Crazy Horse sound, was somewhere between Harvest and Rust Never Sleeps, as opposed to maybe just Rust Never Sleeps, a classic Crazy Horse sounding album. The theme and the overall feel of the album too was much darker and had resulted from the suicide of Kurt Cobain, the frontman and guitarist of Nirvana and leader of the grunge movement. So what was kind of an interesting thing was that Neil Young had been sort of deputized as the godfather of grunge with his band Crazy Horse, having really helped create that sound early on, although it was certainly not called grunge and he was not from Seattle or anything of that nature. But bands like Pearl Jam, Nirvana, Soundgarden had cited Neil Young and Crazy Horse and his guitar stylings as an artist that had influenced them. And so very early on, in 1991, when grunge was first starting to break through in that era, Neil Young was talked about as being the godfather of grunge, and he still gets that title today, and I think rightly so. So being the first album that he was releasing with the return to Crazy Horse, because in 1992, he did the acoustic thing. Instead of going out and doing a grunge sounding album, which he probably should have done, he did the complete opposite. But having returned to, a sound of an album that was one of his most famous from 20 years earlier was also maybe the best thing he could have done, because it was what everyone had screamed for 20 years. And Neil notoriously does not do what people expect him to do, or does not make the albums that people want him to make. So it took him 20 years to make the follow-up to Harvest, which the record label at the time was screaming for and had wanted, back in 1972, 73, which didn't happen. Although I'm sure in 1992, his record label Reprise was saying, make a Crazy Horse grunge sounding album to capitalize on this. And he didn't do that either, but he did have great success with Harvest Moon. But now he makes the Crazy Horse album, and yet it is not grunge sounding, in my opinion. It's really a cross because it is a slower, more acoustic laden with the overtones of Crazy Horse in there, but very little of it has that grunge flavor. Yet the thing is, I think that actually is what makes this album so successful, is how different it is from all the other Crazy Horse albums, giving it something else that, could be what influences the album, what defines the album. And having had that as part of it, I think is the thing that, again, makes this album stand out. And so I think that's one of the reasons this album should be celebrated as a success, as a comeback. A comeback, yes, he had already returned with Harvest Moon, but a comeback in terms of the Crazy Horse sound, doing something new, something fresh. It might not have done big in the sales department, but I would say this is a comeback. This is not a catastrophe. But as we've talked about with some of these other albums, those of you that were huge Crazy Horse fans looking for a Crazy Horse sounding album, you might have thought this was the catastrophe at the time. I remember myself thinking, this does not sound like previous album Ragged Glory or any of the other albums that I loved by Crazy Horse. I quickly fell in line with it because it was just that good of an album, and hopefully you guys think so as well. But hey, let me know your thoughts on all 5 of these albums that we touched on here. These albums turning 30, originally released in 1994, now maybe being seen differently in a new light 30 years on in 2024. Are they comebacks or are they catastrophes? Let me know your thoughts. All right, everyone, take care, have a good one, and I'll talk to you real soon. Bye-bye.